At 11:47 a.m. on November 14, 2025, inside the oak-paneled chambers of the U.S. District Court in Massachusetts, Attorney General Letitia James stood before Judge Cameron Curry with a file that would shake the foundations of federal power. The government had been shut down for 17 days. 42 million Americans were about to lose their food assistance. And in Washington, Speaker Mike Johnson had just declared the whole exercise pointless. He had no idea that the woman in the dark navy blazer was about to prove him catastrophically wrong. "Your Honor," James began, her voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "When politics becomes a weapon against the hungry, the law must become their shield." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she opened the manila folder. Inside lay evidence of the most audacious power grab in modern political history. The Trump administration wasn't just shutting down the government, they were weaponizing hunger itself. James had spent her entire career preparing for this moment. From her days as a public defender in Brooklyn to prosecuting corporate executives who thought money made them untouchable, she understood one fundamental truth: power respects only power. And today she was about to show Washington what the power of law looked like. 3 hours earlier, in the marble corridors of the Capitol, Johnson had stood before the cameras with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. His face flushed with righteous anger as he jabbed his finger toward the press corps. "The whole exercise was pointless," he declared, his Louisiana accent thick with frustration. "Democrats didn't achieve anything. They used the American people as leverage in their political games." Behind him, his communications director shifted nervously. The internal polling numbers had come in that morning, and they weren't good. 68% of Americans blamed Republicans for the shutdown. But Johnson's advisors had convinced him to stay the course. "Double down," they'd said. "Project Strength." It was exactly the wrong strategy against Letitia James. But 240 miles northeast, in her lower Manhattan office, James had been assembling something Johnson never saw coming. Not a political response. A legal trap. At exactly 6:30 a.m. that morning, her phone had buzzed with a text from Maria Santos, a single mother of 3 in the Bronx. "Ms. James, my EBT card stopped working. My kids haven't eaten since yesterday. Please help." It was the 73rd message like it she'd received since the shutdown began. 73rd. She'd counted them all, reading every single story of families choosing between rent and food, parents skipping meals so their children could eat, elderly Americans rationing medication to afford groceries. Each message was filed meticulously in a folder marked "Evidence of Harm," because to Letitia James these weren't just political talking points, they were exhibits in what would become the case of the century. James set down her coffee and reached for the red phone on her desk, the direct line to her litigation team. "Get me everything on the SNAP contingency fund," she said, her voice deadly calm, "and find out exactly how much money agriculture is sitting on while people starve." What her team discovered would redefine the meaning of political accountability. By 9:15 a.m., the evidence was undeniable. The Department of Agriculture had $5.2 billion in emergency funds specifically designated for situations like this. Not only were they refusing to use it, they were actively lying about why. The USDA's official statement claimed the well has run dry. Internal emails obtained through emergency discovery told a different story. Agriculture Secretary Russell Vought had written to his staff, "Let them feel the pain. Pressure creates compliance." But the smoking gun was buried deeper in the email chains. A strategy memo from the White House Office of Management and Budget laid out the administration's real plan: target high SNAP participation states first. California, New York, Pennsylvania. These blue states will pressure their Democratic senators to fold. They weren't protecting taxpayer dollars. They were manufacturing a crisis to force political surrender. They were using American families as human shields in a political war. James leaned back in her chair and smiled. Not with joy, but with the cold satisfaction of a prosecutor who just found the smoking gun. She picked up her pen and began drafting what would become the most consequential lawsuit of the shutdown. Meanwhile, in Washington, Johnson was doubling down on his strategy. At his 10:30 a.m. press conference, he gestured dramatically toward charts, showing government waste, his voice rising with each statistic. "We've been the adults in the room," he insisted, his tie slightly askew from the morning's heated meetings. "We passed a clean resolution weeks ago. The Democrats chose politics over people." But even as he spoke, cracks were appearing in his armor. Behind him, Congressman Dan Crenshaw shifted uncomfortably, checking his phone for updates from his Houston district where food banks were running empty. In the back of the room, a reporter held up her phone showing a viral TikTok video, a grandmother from Louisiana, Johnson's own state, crying as she explained that her medications cost more than her monthly food budget. The optics were becoming toxic. Every hour the shutdown continued, more stories emerged of federal workers choosing between gas money and groceries, of military families visiting food pantries, of seniors rationing insulin. The adults in the room were looking increasingly like children throwing a tantrum while the house burned down around them. In private calls, Republicans were beginning to question whether keeping the House in recess while Americans went hungry was really the winning strategy Johnson claimed it was. Conservative talk radio hosts, usually reliable allies, were fielding angry calls from listeners who couldn't understand why their representatives were on vacation while families suffered. At 11:30 a.m., James's lawsuit hit federal court like a thunderbolt. 25 state attorneys general had joined her in what legal experts would later call the most coordinated challenge to federal power abuse in a generation. The court filing was surgical in its precision. It didn't just argue that withholding SNAP funding was illegal, it proved that the administration had the money and was deliberately choosing not to spend it. The lawsuit requested an immediate injunction, forcing agriculture to release the funds within. But the real masterstroke was the evidence James had uncovered about the administration's true motivations. Email after email revealed a calculated strategy to maximize suffering in blue states. California, New York, Pennsylvania, the states with the highest SNAP participation, were being targeted specifically to create pressure on Democratic lawmakers. It wasn't governance, it was hostage-taking. At 12:15 p.m., as James was presenting her case, her phone buzzed with a CNN alert. Breaking: House Republicans revolt against Johnson's shutdown strategy. The story detailed growing unrest within the GOP. Marjorie Taylor Greene and Kevin Kiley had publicly questioned keeping Congress on recess during the crisis. Moderate Republicans were beginning to break ranks. Johnson's pointless exercise was becoming his political nightmare. In the courtroom, Judge Curry leaned forward as James presented the government's internal communications. One email from Vaught's chief of staff was particularly damning. "The speaker wants maximum leverage. Keep the funds locked until Pelosi blinks." James paused deliberately, letting the weight of those words settle over the courtroom. This was the moment she'd been building toward, the moment when political theater met legal reality. "Your Honor," James said, holding up the printed email, "this is not budget management. This is political extortion using food security as the weapon." In the gallery, a food bank director from Worcester quietly wiped away tears. She'd been serving triple the normal number of families since the shutdown began, watching her shelves empty while knowing billions sat unused in federal accounts. The government's attorney, a pale man in an ill-fitting suit, rose to object. "Your Honor, the administration has broad discretionary authority during appropriations lapses." "Discretionary authority to violate federal law?" James interrupted, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Discretionary authority to let children go hungry while sitting on billions designated specifically for this purpose. Your Honor, discretionary authority ends where constitutional duty begins." The courtroom erupted. Reporters frantically typed on their phones. In the gallery, advocates for food security leaned forward, sensing the tide turning. Judge Curry raised her hand for silence. The courtroom held its collective breath. "I'll hear the government's response, but I must say, Counselor, these communications appear deeply troubling." The judge's tone was ice-cold professional, but her meaning was unmistakable. The government's case was collapsing in real time. Back in Washington, Johnson was fielding increasingly desperate calls from his own caucus. At 1:45 p.m., his deputy chief of staff burst into his office with news that would change everything. "Speaker, we have a problem. Federal judge in Massachusetts is about to rule on the SNAP lawsuit. Early reports suggest she's siding with the states." Johnson's face went white. He understood immediately what this meant. A federal court ruling would strip away his last remaining leverage and make him look both powerless and heartless. "Get the president on the line," he said quietly. "We need to end this now." But it was too late. At 2:30 p.m., Judge Curry's ruling came down like a gavel of justice. The court ordered the immediate release of SNAP funds, finding that the administration's refusal to use available emergency money constituted an abuse of discretionary authority that shocks the conscience. The judge's written opinion was devastating. When government officials use the suffering of vulnerable Americans as a negotiating tactic, they abandon the fundamental duty of public service. The Constitution does not permit hunger to be weaponized for political gain. Within minutes, "Injustice Served" was trending on social media. News alerts pinged across millions of phones. The story wasn't about political maneuvering anymore. It was about a state attorney general who had outmaneuvered the federal government's most powerful players. But the real earthquake was happening in Washington. Within 30 minutes of the ruling, Johnson's office was fielding calls from Republican governors whose state budgets were bleeding red ink from the shutdown's economic damage. The business community, usually reliable GOP allies, was demanding an immediate end to the crisis as supply chains buckled and federal contracts evaporated. The phone call that sealed Johnson's fate came at 2:47 p.m. from Texas Governor Greg Abbott. "Mike, end this now. I've got oil refineries shutting down because federal inspectors are furloughed. My donors are furious. You're destroying our brand." For Johnson, it was the beginning of the end. The man who thought he was playing three-dimensional chess had just been checkmated by a woman with a law degree, in an unshakable belief that justice mattered more than politics. At 3:15 p.m., James emerged from the courthouse steps into a sea of cameras and microphones. She didn't smile, she didn't celebrate. She simply stated the facts. "Today the law proved stronger than politics," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "No administration, Republican or Democrat, has the right to use hunger as a weapon. The Constitution protects the vulnerable, not the powerful." Behind her, the other attorneys general who had joined the lawsuit stood in solidarity. California's Rob Bonta, Pennsylvania's Josh Shapiro, Michigan's Dana Nessel. Democrats and Republicans, united not by party, but by principle. A reporter shouted from the crowd, "Attorney General James, Speaker Johnson called this whole shutdown a pointless exercise. What's your response?" James paused, her eyes finding the camera. For a moment, the facade of prosecutorial professionalism cracked, revealing something deeper, a mother's anger at seeing children used as political pawns. The only thing pointless about this exercise was the unnecessary suffering it caused. Justice is never pointless. Protecting families is never pointless. Holding power accountable is the point of our entire system. The shutdown ended 6 hours later. At 9:47 p.m., Johnson stood in the Speaker's office, his earlier bravado replaced by the hollow stare of political defeat. The clean, continuing resolution he'd passed weeks earlier was now heading to the president's desk, virtually unchanged. All the leverage he thought he had evaporated the moment a federal judge reminded Washington that some things are bigger than politics. The irony was crushing. He'd spent weeks claiming Democrats were playing politics with people's lives, only to be exposed for doing exactly that himself. The very accusation he'd hurled at his opponents had become the mirror reflecting his own actions. His chief of staff handed him the evening briefing papers. The lead story was already written: how Letitia James ended the shutdown with a single lawsuit. "Sir," his aide said quietly, "the early polling numbers are in. 73% of Americans blame us for the shutdown. Your approval rating dropped 12 points today alone. And sir," the aide hesitated, "the focus groups are brutal. Suburban women are using words like cruel and heartless to describe our strategy." Johnson nodded silently and walked to his window overlooking the National Mall. Below, the monuments stood illuminated against the darkness, monuments to leaders who understood that government exists to serve people, not to starve them for political advantage. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd called the Democrats' resistance pointless, but in the end, it was his own strategy that had proven futile. You can shut down the government, but you can't shut down justice. You can silence Congress, but but you can't silence the courts. And you definitely can't silence Letitia James. 3 weeks later, internal GOP polling would show the shutdown fight had cost Republicans 14 points in generic congressional ballot testing. The party that claimed to be protecting taxpayers had been exposed as willing to starve families for political theater. The damage went deeper than polls could measure. Corporate donors, who had reliably supported Republican candidates, began holding back contributions, unwilling to be associated with what one Fortune 500 CEO privately called political sadism. The suburban voters who had powered GOP victories for decades started looking at Democratic alternatives, particularly women voters who saw their own families reflected in the stories of struggle during the shutdown. But for Maria Santos in the Bronx, the politics didn't matter. Her EBT card worked again, her children had food on the table, and she knew that somewhere in Manhattan, a woman in a dark blazer had fought for her when no one else would. That evening, Maria had sent one final text to James. "Thank you for remembering that we're people, not poker chips." It was a message James would frame and keep on her office wall, a reminder of why the law exists and who it's meant to protect. That's the power of justice over politics. That's the power of someone willing to stand up and fight when fighting matters most. That's why they call her the people's lawyer, because when the powerful forget who they serve, she reminds them with the force of law and the weight of conscience. The shutdown was over. The lesson was just beginning. What do you think? When politicians use hunger as a weapon, should attorneys general like Letitia James have the power to stop them in court, or does that give too much authority to unelected officials? Let me know in the comments. If this story of justice taking on political power inspired you, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of accountability in action, where the law meets the powerful and justice always has the final word. And hit that notification bell, because the next time someone tries to weaponize government against the people, you'll want to know how the fighters for justice respond. In a world where power thinks it's untouchable, we prove that nobody is above the law. This dramatized story is based on real events and public records. All quotes and dialogue are fictionalized for commentary and educational purposes, inspired by documented actions and public statements during the 2020